I'm going to switch gears a little and talk this morning about social class. Discussing social class used to be something of a taboo in the United States. We're all equal here was the predominant view. There isn't really such a thing as social classes in America, though the evidence has always demonstrated otherwise. Suddenly, our screens and our airwaves are filled with stories about social class. Specifically, it seems working class people. Journalists are asking which social class voted for whom in the election, as if there's like a social class caucus where people decide how they'll vote as a class. Is the working class in America left behind, they're asking. And how do we bridge what we now clearly understand to be the chasm between working class Americans and upper middle class America? I know that the sermon title made it seem like I have some fix to suggest. Healing across the social divide, I thought, as I began writing this sermon on Monday. What was I thinking? That happens with sermon titles sometimes. So a few things to address my own sermon title, anxiety. First, I should say that my focus is really pretty narrow. I want to address specifically social class divisions in American houses of worship. I think that's, for us, maybe the beginning of addressing those divisions more widely. It was a piece of my recent dissertation. I read authors on social class who wrote hundreds of years ago, and some who are writing in the 21st century. After studying the issue, I think that our social class divisions show up maybe more clearly in our faith homes than in any other institution in modern Western society. And therefore, I want to take a faith approach to addressing the problem, especially this morning. I know that what I'll put forward is not a fix. It is a suggestion for a place to begin. But first, I want to talk a little bit about social class and how it's measured. And hang in there. We'll get to the faith part. There are 4 scales that sociologists use to assign a social class. Forgive me if this is review. Income, wealth, education level, and sometimes education level is broken up into degrees held and years of education, because some of us take extra long to finish degrees, and so when I finished, my mom asked me, "How many years have you been in school?" So income, wealth, education level, and job prestige, which is an old scale that's used by sociologists to measure basically the amount of social capital and power a job affords in a given society. As you can imagine, there's a lot of gray area in deciding to which social class you belong. For example, the job of professor ranks high on the job prestige scale. But what if you're a professor with no wealth and an income that puts you at the poverty level? Do your education and your job prestige make you middle or upper middle class? So when I interviewed working class Unitarian Universalists, instead of going into the project with a definition of working class, I let them decide whether they were working class, in part because of one other piece of the puzzle. Your place on those 4 scales combine to allow you access to certain social spaces in a way. For the most part, the more money and education you have, the more prestigious job you're likely to have, the more access you have to social power. But your particular place in those measures creates what one sociologist calls your social habitus, maybe more easily described as a social class habitat. It's the water you swim in because of most likely the way you were raised. It has to do with everything from the sports you prefer, to the movies you enjoy, to the music you like to listen to, the books you read, the social events you attend, the company you prefer. This, the social class habitat, I think is especially important when it comes to religion. Because every Sunday we create a habitus, or habitat with our conversations and our music and the sermons and everything we do? One of the questions I asked was, can working class people thrive in the UU religious habitat? And I think you better believe it, and I'll demonstrate that to you in a minute. But is it a challenge? Sometimes, yes. I know we'd like to think that in our houses of faith, social class doesn't matter. But it seems social class diversity in American religion has always been a challenge. In fact, after the separation of church and state, as churches were no longer funded by the state and the concept of a true town or neighborhood parish vanished in Protestantism, you'd think people would drift to the congregations that best fit their beliefs. And maybe they did. But one thing is for sure, that drifting had the effect of dividing religious Americans up along lines of social class. In 1929, Richard Niebuhr wrote a book about those divisions called The Social Sources of Denominationalism. He described what he saw as a tragedy. He was sort of heartbroken about denominationalism, all the denominations in Protestantism. And he included Unitarians and Universalists, by the way. He saw American Protestants divided by social class. The religions of the disinherited, as he called them, faiths like Pentecostalism, which contained mostly working class people. On the other side of the scale were churches of the middle class, he said, like Unitarianism, Episcopalianism. They were more formal, with educated clergy and official roles in the denomination. Niebuhr saw a more or less direct relationship between being poor or working class and being part of a religion like Pentecostalism. That came to be called deprivation theory, or a branch of deprivation theory. Ultimately, that kind of thinking is too simplistic. What I think is happening is that every person in just about every faith tradition is making complicated trade-offs based on all sorts of variables. I've talked to Episcopalians who don't believe in the creeds, but love their congregations and the social justice work of their denominations. I know gay couples who have banded together to create a tongue-speaking Pentecostal congregation, like the ones they grew up in. There are lots of factors that go into choosing a faith, and social class is just one of them, but it seems like a really important one. So what about Unitarian Universalism? Remember those 4 scales I talked about: wealth, income, education, and job prestige. Every time those have been measured widely across faiths, Unitarian Universalism ranks either first or second in every scale. And there is moral quicksand all around that. I've heard insufferable UUs fall into the trap of, nobody here, of congratulating ourselves for being smart. And the implication seems to be smarter than other people. You can't respect people's inherent worth and dignity and call them dumb. And anyway, the truth is people are not averages. We are diverse and complicated. There are working class people in just about every Unitarian Universalist congregation. There are even more of us who grew up working class and whose social class habitats much more easily conform to working class tastes than middle or upper middle class preferences. We must not hear these averages and use them as cover for nasty behavior, for prejudicial speech, for mistaken assumptions. With a little humility, we'll hear those averages and realize just how much work we have to do, how much listening is before us, how much privilege we have to overcome if we're to achieve our vision of a united, love-centered, peaceful world in which a gathering like this one is welcoming of working class people. It's hard work because everything in us, as is demonstrated by all these groupings of religion in social class, Pentecostalism and Unitarianism, it hasn't changed in 100 years. It's hard work, this diversifying, or at least making welcome folks from various social classes, because everything in us wants to group ourselves, to have some people as in and some people as out. It is an evolutionary tendency that kept our ancestors alive and kills us now. I call it the original sin of humanism, this tribalism, the sin that atheist and agnostic humanism proclaims we must work through to be saved. Some will ask why we should even worry about these divisions. In fact, I came across that question about a decade ago, just a few months after transferring from ministry in the Church of the Nazarene to the UUA. I attended my first UU ministers retreat. Now, I had been a Christian Universalist for a long time. I had no trouble with the theology of Unitarian Universalism, none. But I felt lost in certain situations. In the Church of the Nazarene, I served mainly farmers and factory workers. My parents were factory workers. Suddenly, I was serving a congregation that was largely full of degreed professionals. I was working with colleagues who had at least a master's degree, more than a few of them from Harvard Divinity School, which to me was ooh la la, you know. I drove a pickup. One of my colleagues told me, I've never had a colleague who drove a pickup truck. A cruiser-style motorcycle. I fished. I hunted a little at the time. And I loved football. I felt I might never find a UU minister to whom I could relate on more than a superficial level. I wondered if it was possible to feel at home or at least be comfortable in the congregation I served. So being an extrovert in pain, I talked about it a lot. I sought out conversations not about my struggles in particular, but about social class and religion in general. I wanted to understand what my colleagues thought about the subject. It was painfully obvious to me that we were divided along lines of social class. In one of those conversations, a soon-to-retire veteran minister said, "We are an upper middle class denomination. I don't know why we can't just accept that and move on." Though he couldn't have known, after all, I had a master's degree, though I was only earning $25,000 a year with no benefits as a part-time minister. I felt as if he was telling me directly that I was not welcome. Similarly, one of the things I found in my dissertation is that too often in UU congregations, working class people are being hurt by the assumptions that are made about them. One of my interviewees was a 60-something man who lives a long way from here. He's married to a UU minister. He's faced a slew of assumptions about the kind of work he does in the world. These are his words. I'd be introduced to somebody, and I'd tell them I work at the university, and they'd be like, "So, what are you a professor of?" You know, it was the assumption that you're a researcher, and he continued, "No, I drive a shuttle." You know, sometimes that's hard to say, and sometimes that's hard to admit, he said. I mean, I'm fine with it, but it's kind of embarrassing at times when it's assumed otherwise. I think there are sometimes assumptions, he said, especially since I'm married to a minister, that I must be degreed. Now, you might say, hey, this just happens. But not everywhere. This man was a charter member of a small UU congregation. And because they knew him well, he didn't experience those same kinds of assumptions there. But he also felt fewer assumptions in Presbyterian and Christian Science settings before he became a UU. Whatever the reason, the assumptions that he faces in UU congregations haven't stopped with his type of work level or formal education. Here again in his words. And this assumes now that folks know that he's a working class guy. He says, "Now I'm the one they come to when the heating isn't working." Or the air conditioner isn't working. Like, well, you're, working class, you should know how to fix this. And he says, look, I'm a member just like you. Why am I supposed to be able to fix this? I think that's a reflection on my working class status. There's a lot of other people around here. Why aren't you asking them? Well, he's a professor, and he's an engineer, and he works there. And then he stopped in our conversation. He goes, I've never asked that question. Maybe I should. It's not intentional. I understand that. But in our work with assumptions and prejudices, and everybody has them. In our work with assumptions and prejudices, effects are more important than intentions. And the effect of these assumptions is exclusion and, frankly, sometimes heartbreak. We didn't set out to get to this place, yet here we are. We are grouped largely along social class lines, but we long for a more united world. In any faith worth its salt, there's always a gap between our aspirations and the way things are now. That's hopeful to me that we're talking about this. And we're talking about it denomination-wide. There are curricula that are coming out. There's a group called UU Class Conversations that's beginning to do workshops about social class in congregations. But the work to bridge that gap begins here. I think that what's most likely to happen in our faith homes is that persistent, strong, working-class people will stick around despite the barbs of persistent, mistaken assumptions, at least in the short term. Our work longer term is to create an environment in which those barbs become the exception, not the rule. A space in which we can recognize quickly when they happen, and we can talk about them without fear of judgment. That will open up a space in which we can tell our stories to one another without fear, and there's the power. One place to start is for each of us, from a place of humility, to question our own attitudes toward other social classes. What do I assume? Is it correct? How do I know it's correct? As you may know, we have some brand new end statements. I mentioned them earlier. Basically, goals for our congregation. One of those end statements talks about putting into practice radical hospitality. Now, to me, that suggests more than just putting out cookies and saying hello to people we don't know. It includes those. It has to include those. Well, the cookies especially, yes, okay. Also the saying hello to people we don't know. But it also means, I think, working on ourselves, challenging my own assumptions, moving past our prejudices when we see them, to make this a more welcoming space across social class strata. Realizing that in the end, no matter our social class status, so much of the good stuff in our lives comes to us not by our own works, but by the grace of the world and the people around us. Widening the working class welcome in our faith is essential as we meet the challenges of these days. And I think we can begin to do it. We really are all us. There is no me and them. May it evermore be so. Amen.